Let's talk a little bit about the other um, uh, families or people that you ended up sort of chronicling and working out here. How did you find these people, and um, uh, where are they situated, sort of, I guess, economically? Because they all tend to be sort of more or less middle class on some level.
Yeah, so everybody's somewhere in the span of the middle class. Initially, when I was working on the proposal for the book, I thought it would go up and down the class ladder, but it just turned out that I couldn't really get anybody who was either very broke or very rich to talk to me for this book. And I think that that's really indicative of the fact that, for the middle class, like, we understand how easily you can fall and sort of how tenuous our position is. And so I think in the middle class, we're a little more open to being like, well, I kind of want to understand this because we're having some issues here. I found that everyone through pretty traditional journalistic methods, right? So one profile, right, Katrina, who's a nurse in Pittsburgh with SEIU, like, I found her through her union. I found a pair of millennial sisters in the public school district for Hattiesburg, Mississippi, just through professional connections who, people who were academics and writers in Mississippi, because I was looking for a Mississippi family.
Why were you looking for a Mississippi family in particular?
I wanted to be in the deep South,
Okay.
And to do a piece about education. And I just felt Mississippi is such an iconic place in that story. So to sort of be like, I'm going to dig in, like, exactly where, when people in the North think about school segregation, we think about places like Mississippi. So we'll go there. And then the other two subjects, so we have Barb, who's a boomer woman who ends up dying because she doesn't have Medicaid in Texas. And I knew her family. So Debbie Nathan, her sister is actually a journalist friend of mine. And then Jared, right, who's a young man who gets given a second chance after being sort of going before a judge with charges of dealing narcotics on school grounds, extortion, and larceny. And then goes on to become a homeowner because he gets a second chance. That's also somebody I sort of personally knew and then was able to convince to work with me on the project.
All right, let's start with Katrina. She is working as a nurse, and she gets certain advantages. And you sort of contrast her experience with her friend, who is Black, and you can see the sort of like divergence there that happens. Tell us briefly just about their story.
Sure. And I should say, I had decided to profile Katrina before I knew she had a Black best friend. So this is just sort of happenstance, which I think suggests that this is probably pretty common. So Katrina, right, had started out as a CNA, right? So sort of a lowest paid job in a nursing home, generally speaking, making beds and sort of doing a little work with patients. And she's working at a corporate nursing home. Pretty aimless, right? She's not an ambitious, directed, sort of move forward person. And, the person in HR says, hey, like, you're really good at this. Do you want to get a nursing degree? We have a scholarship program. You should apply. And Katrina's like, well, I don't know. The HR person keeps being like, no, you should really apply. Right. And so Katrina ends up going to nursing school and becoming a nurse, becoming a union leader, right? All because this person in HR was like, hey, Katrina, you should do this. Right. And occupational segregation in healthcare is very significant, right? Almost, it's a huge proportion of workers at the CNA level are Black and brown. And then the further up you go, the income and status ladder, the whiter it gets, right? And so Katrina gets sort of put on an escalator, right? That she just sort of can sort of get on and get going. As long as she stays on it, she's going to be fine. Jasmine, meanwhile, as a high school student, figures out to get a CNA license so she can make more money to save for school. And, she goes to the guidance counselor to do that. She's at a mostly white high school. And when it comes time to do college applications, the guidance counselor is pestering all of her white friends saying like, hey, you should apply here and you should apply here and don't give up on college. And when Jasmine asks about going to college to be an RN, the guidance counselor says, oh, well, don't you already have your CNA license? Don't you just want to do that? Right. And kind of discourages her from it. Right. So Jasmine, ends up same sort of income arena as Katrina has, in part because they're both in union jobs, right, which limits sort of the racial disparities in wages. But she has to fight a lot harder, right, to get up into like an RN position.
Let's talk about Lindsay and Marianne Becker. They're members of, I think there were two other siblings in that family. and but their experience in going to both the experience of going to a school that is subject to white flight, but also this gifted and talented program, which, back in the day when my daughter was young enough, like I had some experience, and it is even in New York City, there was a similar dynamic. When you walk into the classrooms, you see like, wait, what's going on here? But tell us about this.
Yeah, so Lindsay and Marianne are going to the public schools in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And, their family is a white family. School district there, I think when they entered was around 80% Black, right? So most of the white families in that community had left the district, right? They were either putting their kids through private school or they had moved entirely out of the city and were going to a county school. Right, as a white family, those parents said, no, we want our kids in this school. There's nothing wrong with it. We don't care if our kids are going to school with Black kids. That's fine. And besides, there's a gifted and talented program. And so we're going to make the most of this program, right? So nationally, I think the average is 8% of white students are put into gifted and talented program. At their elementary school, 42% of the white students were in the gifted and talented program. And the difference was so stark that the Becker's mom, she was like, yeah, pretty much like all the white kids ended up in the gifted and talented program. Like it was a very white space. And if my kids hadn't been in that program, and I believe her when she says she doesn't care about race, like she's a very spiritual person. Like I don't think on a one-to-one level, she carries a lot of prejudice, but she was very clear. Like if my kids were not in that program that was getting the extra resources, we would have moved, right? We would have figured out going somewhere else. And then, what I do with the two sisters is because the Hattiesburg was going through a transition during their education, right? The older sister, Lindsay, right? She graduates when it's about 20% white district. And she's sort of able to really make use of these targeted resources and get out and get a good scholarship and so on and so forth. But by the time Marianne is coming up through the district about 5 years later, it's really lost a lot of its resources, and she ends up not getting a sufficient education to perform well in college, right? So she's in the gifted and talented, she's in the extracurriculars, she gets a scholarship to a liberal arts school up north, and then she gets into classes and realizes she can't write, and she ends up, dropping out, coming back home, and sort of going on a very different path from her sister.
What happened? What was it that caused those resources to be drained from the gifted and talented program there?
Right. Well, a lot of it was the white flight, right? Because it wasn't just people leaving the schools, it was people leaving the county. And so taking their tax dollars into the next district. And then as you saw that white flight leaving, the businesses also left. And interestingly, this is unusual, Hattiesburg straddles two counties. So they would just go over the county line. So they'd still be in Hattiesburg City. So they still get all the municipal services, but all the taxes for schools are going to the county school. Right. And so you had like a massive shopping mall develop on the far side of the city out there. And so all of the taxes from that retail are going to support the county school where all the white students have moved to. And interestingly, that county district now, because middle class Black families figured out that was a much better education, they started moving out there. And as that school has become increasingly integrated, now you see white families moving to a district like sort of north in the county, right? So you're sort of seeing this shift happen again.
Oh, so it's just I mean, that makes it even more explicit, right? That it's just the presence of Black students that are driving white people out. It's no longer a function of like, the school is not good. There doesn't seem to be the same level of pretense that's associated with that.
I mean, I don't think I could get anybody to say that on record, but that is very much the colloquial understanding in the community there, right? That, folks left Hattiesburg and went to Oak Grove, and now the white families are starting to go up to Summerall, right? And that they'll just sort of keep chasing in that way.
The story of Jared, who had, issues, he sold some drugs, essentially. It reminded me of Chris Hayes's book, A Colony in a Nation, where he outlined, I think it was, if I remember correctly, like he had some pot in his a jacket that he didn't remember when they were going into like like one of the political conventions. And, or maybe it was as a kid. I don't know. I may be getting stories mixed up, but it was basically that same story where, like, had he been black when he got caught with whatever it was he was caught with, it would have implicated the rest of his life. In this instance, it was just like the cop saying, like, don't do this again. And that was it. And so there was the similarity. Tell us the story of Jared.
Yeah, so Jared, right, is a skater kid in Connecticut in the 90s. And, his parents were divorced. He spent a lot of time by himself. And he got in with some kids where he had a friend who was like the weed dealer. And Jared was like, well, I'll be the LSD guy, right? I'll be the acid guy. So he buys a sheet of hits from like a friend of a friend and then starts taking them to school to sell off. And after a few times of this, he gets caught, right, by the school safety officer, gets arrested. At school, like put into the cop car, like on campus, gets suspended. When he comes back, he goes to the snitch and sort of shakes him down for a little money and kind of threatens him. So ends up with extortion and larceny charges. So by the time he gets before a judge, it's like 1995. His parents have made it to every one of his hearings, right? So they're middle-class folks. They were able to pay for a lawyer for Jared, in part because his dad had been an engineer. So his dad was actually unemployed at the time, but had a 401k, which he had because he'd been an engineer. He'd been an engineer because he had a grad degree. He got the grad degree by working for Kodak up in Buffalo, which I found actually has a long history of sort of charges of employment discrimination, right? So it seems really unlikely Jared's dad would have been on that path if he had been a black man. So Jared, anyway, has sufficient legal support and sort of parental support that he's able to go before the judge at the height of punitive drug policing and just get given sort of like, okay, we're going to suspend your sentence, keep your nose clean, and then do some community service and you'll be fine. And so Jared gets through that, right? And ends up becoming, he now works as a public health nurse out in California.
And the point being that this is not something that has, he's not serving time. He's not, he doesn't have some permanent record that inhibited his ability to get jobs, to get loans, to get anything.
Right. And particularly, right, this, in terms of the white bonus, right, this ends up being very valuable, right? So there are all these fees now associated with the criminal justice system and any kind of incarceration. So the things that Jared avoided, right, include like $20,000 in direct fees he probably would have been charged. And then he was able to earn at least $50,000 roughly in just working minimum wage because he was able to be employed during that time. Right. I didn't even get into calculating the long-term effects on wages and things like that, because so much of that is about sort of veering on a very different path. Right. Because Jared was very clear with me. He's like, if I had gone to prison at that time in my life, he's like, I would have come out a criminal and I would have kept doing that sort of stuff. He's like, I would have gotten hard. I would not have learned my lesson. Right. And that's, not just like in human capital, just in capital, right? Like it's very expensive to be incarcerated.
Let's talk. There's one more story, but people can read the book about that, because I just want to talk a little bit about this. Both, and we should say at the end, you basically tally up the dollar figures on this and work it out. And this, I think you make it clear, like, it's not an exact science, but you're probably underestimating on some level, like if someone was to come in and be able to actually assess this. But let's talk about the idea of, like, how we rectify this in a material sense. You bring up solidarity dividends. Walk us through that a little bit.
Right. Solidarity dividends, right? This is an idea that I came to know through Heather McGee's work with the Sum of Us, right? Which is sort of the benefits you get when people come together across class and race lines, right? To demand a collective solution to something, and this is something that, I've been in a relatively unique position as an American, because I live in rent stabilized housing in New York City, right? And that's been really key to sort of the arc of my life. And that's something that was created by an interracial, group of organizers, like first as rent control and then later as rent stabilization. And so solidarity dividends can be so valuable because they not only like give you benefits, they also alleviate the need for the kinds of stuff that families are often on the hook for, right? Like, so when I'm tallying my white bonus in the book, it's mostly cost of education, some help with housing, things like that, things that I wouldn't need from my family so much, right? If we did a better job of supporting that collectively as a public, right? And so I think for me, the white bonus is really important to be talking about, because once I'm honest about the things that I get, I can also look at the things that I have to pay for that what racism is costing me, because we're unable to build a sufficient political movement that can demand these things from government.
Will you just once extrapolate a little bit on that concept of how racism inhibits the ability of this universality? Because we've seen this time and time again with programs that get diminished sort of popular support when they're perceived as servicing only non-white people. And we see programs, like you write about the GI Bill in your book. This is available to everyone coming out of the military, except for your dollars are no good here if you're black in 1947, and you're going to the vast majority of colleges in the country.
Right. So, I think in current history, right, like Medicaid is the big example of this, right? So we've got 10 states that have not expanded Medicaid to working age childless adults under the ACA, and the social science is really clear, social science and political science, very clear that is as a result of white racism, like white voters not wanting to support something because they think that Black people are going to benefit from it, right? So that's sort of the clearest one right now. But there's also, really interesting correlations around white voter support for public higher education and sort of the taxes that are required to pay for it, right? It was really instructive to me to look at, during the GI Bill, when it was understood by people in power that everybody using it was going to be white, right? College is free. You get some help with your books, right? You get up to the boomers, like it's a little more diverse, a little less support. You get up to sort of moving towards Gen X, right? And all of a sudden, and you're getting more and more diverse. All of a sudden, like white voter support for public institutions and taxation that leads to things like education tanks, right? So I bring this out in Jared's profile, talking about Prop 13 out in California, right? And so now, right, when we have probably the most diverse college-age population that we've ever had in this country, right, you basically have to mortgage your future just to get into the middle class.
The book is White Bonus, 5 Families and the Cash Value of Racism in America. Tracie McMillan, thank you so much for your time today. We'll put a link to that at majority.fm and in the podcast and YouTube description.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.